evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams. I know it's been a while since I did a video. My parents are still here visiting me on vacation, but I'll take some time to talk to you for a while. I was reviewing the Big C, and I look back at the Big C that we've been going over, the first autobiography of Langston Hughes, and I noticed that we missed a point, and I want to get into that tonight. I was reading in Central High, the chapter called Central High, an incident that happened to Langston Hughes, which is related to the Chicago race riots. Now, I did a video about the race riots, but I didn't release it because I didn't look at it correctly, and I had some time to sleep on and think about it, and I think I got the point today. And what Langston Hughes mentions in his autobiography is very significant about what the Chicago race riots was about. So I'm going to read to you the paragraph where he mentions the Chicago race riots and how it relates to what happened to him. South Street was in its glory then, a teeming Negro street with crowded theaters, restaurants, and cabarets, and excitement from noon to noon. Midnight was like day. The street was full of workers and gamblers, prostitutes and pimps, church folks and sinners. The tenements on either side were very congested. For neither love nor money could you find a decent place to live. Profiteers, thugs, and gangsters were coming into their own. The first Sunday I was in town, I went out walking alone to see what the city looked like. I wandered too far outside the Negro district, over beyond Wentworth, and was set upon and beaten by a group of white boys who said they didn't allow niggers in that neighborhood. I came home with both eyes black and a swollen jaw. That was the summer before the Chicago riots. Now, I asked myself the question, why is it significant that he says that was the summer before the Chicago riots? And what were the Chicago riots? Well, the Chicago riots is also termed the Chicago Race Wars of 1919. And what is very significant about this and what surprised me was that one of the people who covered the Chicago race riots back during this time was Carl Sandburg. Now, we mentioned Carl Sandburg because Carl Sandburg is a poet that influenced Langston Hughes to write prose. And he talks about Carl Sandburg prior to mentioning the Chicago race riots, where he says, one of his teachers, Ethel Weimer, discovered Carl Sandburg for me. Although I had read of Carl Sandburg before in an article, I think in the Kansas City Star, about how bad free verse was, I really didn't know him until Miss Weimer in second year English brought him, as well as Amy Lowell, Vaco Lindsay, and Edgar Lee Masher to us. Then I began to write like Carl Sandburg. And then he goes on to say, and about Carl Sandburg, my guiding star, I wrote. And then he wrote a poem about Carl Sandburg. Well, Carl Sandburg was also a news writer, and he covered the Chicago riots, which I'm going to read to you his coverage about the Chicago riots and exactly what he was getting at when he wrote this article. Now, this article, you should read it. It's more than an article, it's more like a small story, but it's called The Chicago Race Riots, July 1919. Now he covers the race riots, he tells you what sparked it, and then he goes on to talk about what precipitated the Chicago race riots, like why did the riots come about and why did it happen? So in the first chapter, it says the Chicago race riots. The so-called race riots in Chicago during the last week of July 1919 started on a Sunday at a bathing beach. A colored boy swam across an imaginary segregation line. White boys threw rocks at him and knocked him off a raft. He was drowned. Colored people rushed to a policeman and asked for the arrest of the boys throwing stones. The policeman refused. As the dead body of the drowned boy was being handled, more rocks were thrown on both sides. The policeman held on to his refusal to make arrests. Fighting then began that spread to all the borders of the Black Belt. The score at the end of 3 days was recorded as 20 Negroes dead, 14 white men dead, and a number of Negro houses burned. The riots furnished an excuse for every element of gangland to go to it and test their prowess by the most ancient ordeals of the jungle. So, he said in here the so-called riots in Chicago began Sunday at a bathing beach. Now, see, that part right there is, when I did the review before, I went with that. However, what Langston Hughes says in here, and according to all of the other articles and research that I have done that talked about what led up to the Chicago riots, the riots started before that Sunday. That Sunday was the last straw. Langston Hughes said that he crossed over beyond Wentworth and was set upon and beaten by a group of white boys. This guy, who was about 17 years old, that it says in some articles, was swimming and crossed the line and was killed by white boys. And if you read articles about Chicago prior to this race riot, you see that black people are constantly being attacked and beaten by white people. And this right here was the final straw. And even though this boy was killed by the white boys, before the black people took action, they went to a police officer to try to get justice. And they didn't get justice. Langston Hughes got beaten up. He went home. He didn't even try to get justice because there was no justice. That is what sparked the Chicago race riots, and that is what the race riots were. And they shouldn't even be called race riots. What the Chicago race riot, and that's why he says so-called race riots in Chicago, that's white people making terroristic attacks on black people constantly, not getting any justice, and the final straw was black men armed themselves, fought back to defend themselves and their family. That's what the race riot was. And I have an article here called Our Changed Attitude, Armed Defense, and the New Negro in the 1919 Chicago race riot. And this gives an account of the riot as well. And this is more than just 3 days. And this gives an account and says that the race riot actually claimed 38 lives, and the majority of those lives lost were African Americans. Now, in this article, Our Changed Attitude, Armed Defense, and the New Negro in the 1919 Chicago race riot, it also goes on to talk about the press coverage during the Chicago race riots. Now, usually when I do my research, I like to get those news article clips myself and read them. However, the news articles that covered the Chicago race riots were very similar to the articles in the news today whenever a black man defends himself with his weapons or when a black family, black woman, or a black child gets a hold of weapons and defends himself against white supremacy, they demonized the black people. Even in the articles back then, they were calling them hoodlums. Today, they like to call them thugs. Back then, they called them hoodlums. And they were given all kind of terrible descriptions of black people back then. And they got their coons that they called leaders of the black community, which said that these hoodlums didn't follow upstanding Negro politics. They didn't follow the rules, and instead of fighting back with violence, they should have followed some upstanding laws to represent the Negro race, the black race back then. So with that said, I said the nonviolent movement led by Martin Luther King should have never happened. The nonviolent movement of Martin Luther King should have never happened, according to the Chicago race riots. Because in the Chicago race riots, that was the final straw. Black people found out and took action that they couldn't get justice by following nonviolent movements, by taking the higher road, by being respectable Negroes, being good Negroes. They found out that that wasn't working. And they said, forget it, we're going to arm ourselves and we're going to take care of ourselves because we can't get justice. And you should know that among those dead in the race riot were police officers, white and black. Some black people did kill black police officers in protecting themselves. So it's not just black people fighting white people. It's black people fighting a system of oppression where they can't find justice. And if that oppression comes with a black face, in Chicago, they took care of that as well. In this article by Jonathan S. Coy, Our Changed Attitudes, they talk about 3 or 4 black police officers who were killed by black people chasing down white people who have killed one of them. It was kind of like how we look at these gang wars. They kill some of us and we kill some of them. Well, this was actually black people protecting themselves, and when a white person would come and start violence and start with them, because that's what it was. When the boy was swimming, he was minding his business, and they attacked him. Langston Hughes, of all people, and as we go forward, you'll see he's the most nonviolent person around. He was attacked. These are literally white people attacking black people who are minding their business. So black people armed themselves, and when these attacks began to take place, the final straw, they started to fight back, and they started to fight back against police officers, whether they were white or black, getting their justice. So with that said, the nonviolent movement that Martin Luther King led in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, that never should have happened because it was already tried. They tried that before. They tried to be respectable Negroes, respectable politics. They tried to go through the system. They tried to seek justice, and it didn't happen back in 1919. And Martin Luther King found out that after those girls were bombed in the church that it wasn't going to happen during his lifetime, and he abandoned the nonviolent movement and will never go back to the nonviolent movement because we understand that the discourse of racism in the U.S. is deep. And in the article that I covered earlier on my page, Zora Neale Hurston, back in the 1940s, when she wrote that letter to County Cullen, she said that white people in the US built this country, built their civilization based on violence. And the only way that we're going to get our freedom is to pay them back with violence and kind. That's the only language that they respect. And she was right. So it's not a Chicago race riot, like one race versus another. It's black people fighting oppression. And then when we go and read The Marrow of Tradition by C.W. Chestnut, that happened in Wilmington, North Carolina, that's another race riot. But a race riot is white terrorists descending upon the black community and trying to slaughter black people, trying to just beat and kill black people with no repercussions. So black people must arm themselves and defend themselves. And what precipitated this riot was all of this violence towards black people. Like today, every day that we watch the news, we're seeing black people getting attacked by white people. Here in Portland, just a couple weeks ago, we had the white terrorists assaulting the black Muslim girls in the bus, and when men stood up to defend the girls, he killed them, and he killed white men. However, he still killed. That's based on race. These white people are attacking black people. All of these police officers are killing black boys and black women and black people, and there's no repercussions. And it's happening over and over and over again, and at some point, it's going to stop. Black people aren't going to take it again. And then we're going to have what is called another race war or race riot. Unfortunately, in these race riots, more black people die than white people because we're outnumbered and outgunned and we don't have justice on our side. However, it still makes a point. These people in Chicago, these black people gave up their lives fighting for what they believed was right and defending their families. And A. Philip Randolph, a name which we all know and should know, he is mentioned in this article where he supports black armed defense. Yes, he supports black armed defense. And let me read a statement in this article that sums up the conflict that black people were having about armed defense. Let me see here. Okay, here it is. Okay. This narrative of the riot reflected and supported a vision of the new Negro framed in terms of a new respectable masculinity. The editors of the Messenger saw the new Negro as a black man or woman willing to sacrifice anything to strike against the structures, institutions, and people who used white supremacy to oppress and exploit black people. That's what the Messenger saw, the black man or woman willing to sacrifice anything. But it reads, Chicago's black leaders, however, depicted the new Negro as an African American man whose actions signified a willingness to engage in violence in defense of family, property, and most importantly, self-respect and dignity, which they termed manhood. Not only would this new Negro be willing to use violence, he would initiate conflict if failing to do so meant acquiescing to humiliation or exploitation. And that's very important that they're mentioning this term called the new Negro, because we'll get into that. And that's back to Langston Hughes. The Chicago black leaders said they supported the African American using violence to defend his family and property and dignity. And they also supported the fact that he would initiate violence before acquiescing to humiliation or exploitation. And they termed it manhood. Back then, it was a man's world. Men ran the neighborhood. Men were the head of the households. Men were setting an example. And it was men engaging with men in these fights. So if the man is not there, if you don't have a man in your household, it's very hard to defend your own household. I'm sorry. But so men fighting men and manhood. And if you notice that in Martin Luther King's latter speeches, after he abandoned the nonviolent movement, he gave speeches about manhood. So you can look up those speeches. You can go on YouTube and just type in Martin Luther King speaks on manhood, and he says, don't let anyone take your manhood. So that's very important when you read these articles. Now back to the Carl Sandburg article. Now when he wrote his piece on the Chicago race riots, it's very, I really recommend that you read it. It's called The Chicago Race Riots, July 1919. And he actually he's a white man, but he actually went into the black community and talked to black people about what was going on in their neighborhood. And he gives a good example of why this war happened and who was involved in the war and why did it happen to spark just then and there. The Great Migration was occurring in 1919. There were black people who were just pouring into the cities, coming up from the South. And they weren't just coming up from the South because of jobs. It wasn't just because of jobs. Chicago had a system so well set that they followed the news down south of lynchings, where lynchings were occurring, when lynchings were occurring, and when injustices against blacks were occurring in the South. And they had it down to a point where they knew when black people were going to start to arrive. So you have people in Chicago coming from the South who were fleeing the violence and injustices of the South. So this was the last place that they went. You know, they left their homes, left their livelihoods in the South because of the violence. Come to Chicago, they weren't going to run anymore. They faced the violence in Chicago, they fought. You had veterans from World War I living in Chicago, black vets who knew how to handle arms, who knew how to handle confrontation, who had been to war, and they weren't afraid to fight. You had those men in this neighborhood, and there's talk about resistance, white people wanting to no longer allow black men to serve because they were learning how to use firearms, they were learning how to fight, they were learning the art of combat, and in these neighborhoods and cities and towns defending themselves, they put that knowledge to work, and they organized. He talks about that. He talks about, he even goes to the point where he talks about how the black leaders used to persuade other black people to act respectable and act in certain ways because they recognize, as we talk about today, which we should just stop talking about it and don't even forget about it, but they said that when one of us acts a certain way, the whole race is looked at through the lens of what this one black person did. White people look at the actions of one black person who does something crazy or something ridiculous and says, look at that nigger, or look at that black person, that's how they all act. Now, we shouldn't really care about what they think. Like Zora Neale Hurston says, she didn't care about what they think. They can think about what they want to think. And sometimes she did, when she wrote Their Eyes Are Watching God, she didn't want to talk about the race conflict or a race problem or whatever. She said, I'm going to talk about black people and I'm going to use black vernacular and forget what they think and focus on our own communities. And we should have that. You know, we already know that many white people and other races look at what one black person does and try to put that on the rest of the race. But, you know, we don't do that, because if we did that, we would be fighting and rioting every day, because we have so many examples in the past of white people just descending upon black people for no reason. No, well, the reason is wherever black people are content, enjoying themselves, or building a community, they don't like that, so they destroy it. And we always talk about what Black Wall Street in Oklahoma. That's just one example. Here's another example. There are race riots, which we need to change the terminology from race riot to, you know, white terrorism upon black people. We have too many examples of that, you know, but they want to change the language, just like when they talk about the settlers fighting against the Indians. When the settlers won, it was a victory. When the Indians won, it was called a massacre. You know, so they changed the language. So, you know, they control the press, and in this article that I have here, they demonize black people. They talked about bills and laws and everything to try to take the guns away from black people. They said that they weren't using them right. They were just running around killing white people, because when white people were getting killed, they would say, look at them, they're killing white people. But then they would turn around and investigate and find out that white people were entering in their neighborhoods shooting at people. And that's so surprisingly, in some of the cases in the Chicago race riots where black people were arrested for killing white people, they got let go and not convicted, because every now and then justice works, and they said these people are defending their own households against white hoodlums. Now that's another thing that Carl Sandburg said here. He talked about many of the white people participating in this were actually from a certain area, which they termed, you know, they were white hoodlums. You know, where it said the riots furnished an excuse for every element of gangland to go to it and test their prowess by the most ancient ordeals of the jungle. There was one section of the city that supplied more white hoodlums than any other section. It was the district around the stockyards and packing houses. So I guess that's another reason why Langston Hughes respected Carl Sandburg, because he, you know, I'm reading his article, and he seems to just be a straight shooter. He talks about white hoodlums, and he talks about black ones, and he talks about black people defending their households, and he talks about the black people who actually participated in the riots. The newspaper coverage was trying to paint every black person that participated as a hoodlum or a thug, and then they got their Sheriff Clarks to come out and try to back up what they said, little coons to try to back it up. And they term these people also as leaders of the black community, because they don't let black people choose their own leaders. You know, they find somebody to speak up for the black community, or who speaks eloquently in the black community, and they try to term them our leaders, when the majority of the black community the majority of the black community many times refuse to accept what these black leaders are saying, because they don't represent anything that we hold dear in the black community. So the Chicago race riots, and I just want to reiterate that when you're reading these autobiographies and when you're reading these stories of our ancestors, these little things can slip past you. He said it in one sentence. That was the summer before the Chicago riots, and I went right past it. But I looked back and I said, hey, we need to investigate what were the Chicago riots. And why did he mention that in reference to what happened to him in Chicago? Because the race riots started back then. It started before this incident happened right here where the boy got drowned. That was the last straw. And one last thing, we still, black people get upset and have riots nowadays, but nowadays all we do is destroy property. Back then, they had targets. Back then, they killed the people who killed them. Back then, if George Zimmerman would have shot Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman would have died that same day. And any police officer who tried to protect George Zimmerman would have died that same day. That girl in the video who was getting stomped and held down by that police officer in that video where you had all those black people around the police officer pulled out his gun and pointed at that police officer. If he would have done that during this time period, he would have been dead. Some black people would have died too, but they were making their point that they couldn't get justice from the police officers, so they were taking actions in their own hands. And a lot of black people today think that black people nowadays are more militant than the black people in the past because we have that perception that all black movements were peaceful and similar to what Dr. Martin Luther King led, which was, it was courageous what Dr. Martin Luther King led. It's hard to march down the throat of racism and not fight. But it never should have happened. And Malcolm X preached that it shouldn't have happened. You know, Malcolm X said the only way that we're going to get our respect is if we fight back. And we have a God-given right to fight back. And we need to start talking about that again, too, because it seems that today we still have a lot of nonviolent movements and this thing of forgiveness. We need to start looking at, if you're going to follow religion and be a Christian, you need to follow the Bible by what it says, because all of this forgiveness is not actually what the Bible talks about. I might do a video on that and look at scripture where it says that you should hate that which God hates. It's fine for you to hate actions, ideas, and sins that God hates. And there, in the other video that I did about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, you know, he was following scripture that said that if you show the wicked man his wicked ways and he doesn't change his wicked ways, then he should die in his iniquity. So if you point out to them, hey, you need to chill out, that's wrong, and they continue to do it, they have the right to die in their iniquity. Now the question becomes, you know, are you supposed to carry out that will of God? You know, that can be the question. But however, you can hate that which God hates. So all of this forgiveness, you're forgiving things. People your relatives getting killed, your relatives getting beat down, your relatives facing this injustice, and you're forgiving that when you shouldn't be forgiving it at all. That's the same. That's worse than the nonviolent movement, because in the nonviolent movement, they weren't actually forgiving; they were trying to make a point. But when you forgive, you're just saying, "Well, okay, God bless you, and I hope everything is fine. I forgive you." You know, you don't need, black people are too quick to forgive. And that's a saying in the black community. Black people are too quick to forgive, and we see it on videos and news every day. Some people even forgave Dylan Roof for what he did. And that's a sin that you can't come back from. What he did, and he don't care. If they tell you that they're not sorry for what they did, then why do you forgive them? So that's the Chicago Race Riots, and we're going to continue in the next video with Langston Hughes and the Big C. He's currently traveling in Mexico in the next video of that. And we're going to look at the Zapatistas and what was going on in Mexico because they were fighting there as well. He gets back with his father. So this is Black Literature, Black History. Jason Williams. Have a nice evening.